I'd like to begin with a caveat. Unfortunately, Dr. Nandakishore, who's the head of the department, who was supposed to deliver the welcome note today, he's caught up in another lecture. So, on his behalf, I would request Dr. Anand to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, Anand.
Thank you, Dheeraj. I hope I am audible.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. I think there was some issue with my mic, I think, today. But anyways, let's hope it works now. I would first of all like to welcome Dr. Rajat Ganguly for today's distinguished lecture on ethnicity in South Asia. This is a very important theme, considering the fact that ethnicity across the world has been an issue which has been creating a lot of conflict and crisis. And South Asia itself is a case in point because we have numerous ethnicities, one of the most diverse regions in the world. Some even compare it with Europe Europe, or even bigger in scale than Europe. In fact, the entire country of India itself could be seen as perhaps as or even more diverse than something like EU for that. And as a result, we have, because of developmental issues, because of religious and sectarian issues cut across it, we have the partition of the country, a partition of South Asia being done on religious and ethnic lines. We see that there is a lot of issues which remains unresolved, and we are still grappling with it. Nevertheless, I feel that India still provides a very good example of how to handle diversity to the world, being part of one of the most diverse regions in the world. It's not just about our diversity in India we are also concerned about. It's about the ethnic diversity in our neighborhood, whether it is Pakistan or whether it is Sri Lanka. Even a much more smaller country like Nepal has its own issues related to ethnicity and ethnic diversity and the lack of a proper management to successfully navigate through that the issues created. So, in order to understand this whole issue of ethnicity I think we need an expert who has worked on this particular area, who will give us, who will illuminate us on this particular theme, and that is why we have brought in the eminent expert, Dr. Rajat Ganguly, for giving us a distinguished lecture on this particular theme, looking at ethnicity in South Asia and especially from India. India as a case in point. So we welcome you, sir, to the department virtually, and we hope that one of these days we'll be able to welcome you physically also. And we really hope all these travel restrictions come down quickly and the COVID pandemic passes soon, so that we can physically meet you and discuss with you all of these things. So Dheeraj, you can go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, for those kind words and the welcome remarks. And so now, before we actually get started with Professor Rajat Ganguly's lecture, I'd like to formally introduce him. So Professor Rajat Ganguly is an academic at Murdoch University in Perth, Australia. And Dr. Ganguly specializes in the field of international relations, international security, defense and strategic studies, conflict studies, with a particular focus on Asia and Asian security and international affairs. And I understand that presently is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs, right? And so just as a background to this talk, I was surveying through Professor Ganguly's work, and I was struck by the amount of work he's produced on ethnic conflict, which shows that he has a very keen interest in the subject. And I think it's our privilege to have him here with us to talk on the topic of ethnicity and nation building. So without much ado, sir, I invite you to take over. The floor is all yours.
Okay. And I want to show a PowerPoint. So what do? Do I just share the screen?
Yes, sir, you can share the screen. Yeah.
So if I say, okay. And
sir, there's an option called share
So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you just have to click that button which says share. It has an upward arrow mark if you
And
can, if you
prior
can.
to,
Yeah,
yes,
I did.
and prior
Some,
to that, I think you should keep presentation open.
yeah, but I'm trying to figure out how do I.
May I ask if you're using a Windows or a MacBook, Windows laptop or a MacBook, sir?
Windows. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
It is loading. Yes, 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 we
If
can see it. Yes,
you can see it, okay.
yes.
So that's good. That's good. Um, so look, I mean, what I was. Thank you very much, first of all, for asking me to talk to you today. It's a real honor and a pleasure. Uh, I do a lot of work on India, so connecting with you guys in India really excites me, and I hope to share some ideas with you today, which hopefully you may find interesting, and we can then have a discussion more in the Q&A. What I was asked to speak today was this topic called ethnicity and nation building in South Asia, India as a case in point. So this was the title that was given to me. I didn't change anything because I thought that within such a broad topic, I might be able to focus on a few things that might be of interest and relevance to you. A lot of this material that I'm going to talk about is part of my ongoing research on ethnicity and ethnic conflict, not only in South Asia but also in India, um, particularly on ethnic insurgencies as they happen. Um, and I'm actually working on a book now for Routledge, which looks at this phenomena of ethnic insurgency and armed conflict, not just in South Asia but across the world. But South Asia features prominently in that. So there will be some material on India as well. So what I want to start off with today, and you have actually already touched upon it. Uh, so this is just as a setting up of the context. We talk about India's ethnic diversity, and most of the data on this comes from the census of 2011. We don't have the 2021 census data yet because it hasn't been completed yet, given the pandemic. So, sorry.
So I think you can continue. It seems that somebody has just unmuted themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
Excuse me,
India's
sir.
ethnic diversity is a massive challenge, and some of you might think of India as probably the last surviving empire. It is not only physically big, but 1.3 billion plus population, incredibly diverse, incredibly complicated. So from a ethnic mosaic point of view, you could argue that India probably is one of the most complex societies, one of the most complex states in the world today. Far more complex than anything that you would find in Europe, uh, or in the former Soviet Union for that matter. India is far more complex than any existing state in the world right now. A truly almost of the proportion of a very complex empire. And just look at the staggering numbers. We have 1.3 billion people. 80% of them are Hindus. Anywhere between 11 to 15% are Muslims. Then you have Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Christians, Parsis, Jews. All the major religions in the world are in India. We have so many languages. Hindi is the national language. English is spoken widely. Plus, we have 18 other co-national languages or languages that are recognized in the Constitution as national languages. Plus, over 750 dialects, regional languages and dialects. So just boggles the mind. I mean, how linguistically diverse we are, how religiously diverse we are. Then when you look at the Hindu community, 80% of the population is Hindu, you look at the complexity within that community in terms of caste, which is a social hierarchy, the word jatis, various caste and subcaste and so on. And these are all hierarchically ranked. Then Hindus are also divided into cultural communities, what we call ethnic communities that are regionally concentrated, that have distinct language, distinct cultural traits, and so on. Plus, within the Hindu community, in terms of religion, there are also different traditions that Hindus follow, and this varies depending on which part of the country you're looking at. Similarly, when you look at the biggest minority, the Muslim community, it is by no means a monolithic community. The states where Muslims are predominantly concentrated are UP, Bihar, West Bengal, but also a significant number of Muslims across India, in Assam, in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and of course Kerala. You can also see Muslims being in a majority in 2 union territories, one in Jammu and Kashmir and one in Lakshadweep. And when you look into the Muslim community, you also find sectarian differences. Majority of Muslims are, of course, Sunni, Deobandi Sunni, but there are significant numbers who are and who come from the smaller Islamic sects like Khojas and Bohras and so on. Then when you look at India's tribal population, the scheduled tribes, we have close to 84, 85 million tribes, divided into various tribes, almost 9%, 8.2 to 9% of the population of the country. And on top of that, you have India's Dalit population, what is called scheduled caste population, anywhere between 16 to 17, 18% of population, staggering numbers that you are looking at. Now, in terms of nation building, when we started our independent journey in 1947, the Constituent Assembly was created to draft India's constitution. Our constitution actually provides for us several things with which we have tried to manage our ethnic pluralism or ethnic diversity. And I'll talk very quickly about some of those things before we then move on to this question of ethnic conflict. Number one in the Constitution is the Bill of Rights, fundamental rights, which we were heavily influenced by the American Constitution. And in the Bill of Rights, there are certain rights that are talked about that safeguard the interest of ethnic communities, particularly ethnic minorities. These rights include, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the key rights in this category are, the right to equality, right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, and the right to constitutional remedies. So these are enshrined in the Constitution, and our framers, the framers of our Indian Constitution, basically believe that India's ethnic plurality, India's diversity, has to be managed by giving every individual as well as different groups the sense of certain fundamental inalienable rights that they have under the Constitution. Secondly, very soon after the promulgation of the Constitution in 1950, we set up the administrative reorganization of the Indian state. And this was basically done, as most of you know, on ethno-linguistic principles. So in other words, we accepted basically the demand that India's provinces have to be redrawn based on broad ethno-linguistic criteria, and this would further recognize and strengthen India's ethnic plurality. So in 1953, the States Reorganization Commission was set up, which led to the enactment of the States Reorganization Act of 1956. And under this act, of course, initially 14 states were set up, 5 union territories were set up, and these obviously have now been expanded. And this process is by no means over. And this is something that I will come back to towards the later part of my presentation. Thirdly, we created a federal polity with the idea that a federal polity would allow the state to accommodate ethnic plurality, encourage cultural distinctiveness, without letting any one ethnic group dominate at the national level. And at the same time, we were very careful about how far to stretch federal ideas, federal rights. Our framers decided that the Indian Constitution must be very mindful of the dangers of federalism. So therefore, in the Indian Constitution, in the federal setup that we have, there is absolutely no right for any ethnic group or any province to secede from the federation, from the union. So this right of secession was denied to ethnic groups and to provinces under the Indian Constitution, and this was very deliberately done with the fear. This was basically based on the fear that if we allow such rights, then this could lead to the balkanization of India. The India won't remain intact. So therefore, some of you, who have studied Indian politics will remember that a lot of people characterized Indian federalism as a federation with centralizing tendencies. And this was deliberately done, that we need a strong central government, a central, focal point of power, because this can only then, keep the nation intact, keep the state intact. So therefore, as part of that, we did accept that, yes, we must have a federal polity where power is shared between the regions and the center. But at the same time, the regions do not have the right to secede. And, some might argue that the central powers are actually quite substantial, leading to the feeling that India is a federation, but with a very strong central or federal government. Fourthly, we introduced the term secular in our constitution, in the preamble to the constitution, by the 42nd Amendment in 1976. This was during the emergency period. And you may argue that, why was this not done at the beginning when the Constitution came into effect in 1950? And this was debated in the Constituent Assembly. And the consensus at that time was that India, by its very nature, was a secular country. And its ethos was secular. So this didn't have to be, literally spelled out and put in the Constitution. So if you read, Baba Sahib Ambedkar's, thinking on the Constitution, I mean, he very clearly was not convinced that the term secularism or secular has to be written in the Constitution. So, but at the same time, there was this understanding that India, being a secular country, would be better able to manage its religious diversity than a country where constitutionally the country is defined as belonging to only one religion. And in India's case, that was not, obviously not the case. But Indian secularism was slightly different from a different point of view. In the West, when you say secular or secularism, what it means is a clear separation between church and state. And the classic example of this would be the United States, the UK, in Britain, etc. In India, on the other hand, the term secular or secularism has come to mean not a total separation between church and state or between religion and state, but rather this kind of new definition where the state actually equally promotes every religion. So the state not only recognizes every religion, the state provides assistance to every religion and equal promotion of all religion by the state. So the state is not, in the Western sense of the term, separate from religion. The state actually is a very big part of the religion, but promotes every religion. This was based on the understanding that, in our day-to-day life, people are deeply religious and follow religion as almost a philosophy of life in India. And this is something that the state had to encourage, promote, and protect rather than create the kind of Western separation that many people in the West are used to. So our secularism was slightly different. We also created a multi-party system on the assumption that ethnic communities will be able to form their distinct political platforms, to voice their grievances, to promote their interest, and therefore the multi-party system would become a mechanism through which ethnic differences, ethnic conflict can be managed. Some of these things can be done. Pluralism can be managed. Now, again, coming back to India's political history, we all know that, although India was a multi-party system, in reality, what happened in India after independence was the overwhelming dominance of the Congress Party, roughly until about the 1960s. So you see the growth of regional parties, regional political parties from the 60s onwards, and there are many reasons why this happened. One factor which often gets talked about is the gradual disintegration of the Congress Party, almost as a big umbrella organization. And this was a process that obviously accelerated after Jawaharlal Nehru died in 1964. So the politics in India after 64, after Nehru's death, and then within a year, the sudden death of Lal Bahadur Shastri, meant that within the Congress there was a massive vacuum of leadership, and this then created a series of things that led gradually to the erosion of the Congress as a big umbrella national party, and various elements from within the Congress came out, and they formed their own smaller parties, and many of these smaller parties. And this is a tendency that has strengthened as we move forward. But the multi-party system as a whole was designed so that it can accommodate and give voice to ethnic demands. And last but not least, I would argue that India very deliberately became a welfare state and a state that actively encouraged what we call affirmative action politics or affirmative action public policies. And again, the word socialist was added to the preamble of the Indian Constitution by the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. So this was done by Indira Gandhi during the emergency time. But India's welfare state system is based on the basic premise that society is unequal. There are significant numbers of people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder, the social ladder, and they would need a sort of a lifting up hand from the state. The state would have to lift them up, and for that, the state would have to provide preferential policies or affirmative action policies. Some of you may actually remember the term quotas. The quota system that was introduced in India was effectively the acknowledgement that certain groups, certain sectors, certain class would require the sort of lifting up hand of the state in order to make society a bit more equal. So welfarism and affirmative action went almost hand in hand, very strongly influenced by what was happening in Europe, the formation of the European welfare state. And Nehru particularly was very, very enamored by what he thought was a brilliant scheme of the command economy of the Soviet Union, where they have plans and the state intervened in every aspect of society and the economy. So this was a model that India adopted, and it was argued that this model would facilitate the management of ethnic violence and so on. Having said that, though, ethnic conflict was never away from India from day one. Those of you who have studied Indian politics would know that, in the immediate aftermath of independence, and I'm not going into the partition politics, we can debate another time. And that's a form of identity politics as well. I'm focusing on post-1947 India. But even in the immediate aftermath of independence, India battled secessionist forces in the Indian Northeast, Mizo uprising, Naga uprising, etc. First war between India and Pakistan over Jammu and Kashmir's accession to India happens in 1948, and that war comes to an end with a UN sponsored ceasefire only in January of 1949. So from day one, we were grappling with various forms of ethnic conflict. And when you look back on this 70 odd years of 7 decades almost of India's history as an independent political state, ethnic conflict has never been far away. But if you want to create a typology of ethnic conflict in India, not all ethnic conflicts are of the same type. I would argue that, by and large, the various types of ethnic conflicts in India can be broken down or can be grouped into 4 categories of conflict. Number one, you have ethno-secessionist conflicts that want to territorially break away from India, either to form a new sovereign state or merge with a neighboring state. So we have seen some of those conflicts, and by their very nature, ethno-secessionist conflicts create the most intense conflict or the most intense violence in a conflict. So that's number one. Number two, we have in India seen ethno-political agitations for recognition of regional identity. And as part of that recognition of regional identity, many of you will be aware that we have had ethno-political movements, agitations for new statehood status within the Indian Federation, within the Indian Union. And some of my previous work, I've done some work on the Gorkhaland movement in West Bengal. It is by no means a settled issue in West Bengal. So this whole, agitations for separate statehood is by no means over, and we may end up by, who knows, by 2040, 2050, India may end up like the United States with almost 50 states, 50 provinces, organized along this broad consensus of ethno-linguistic identity. So this is a second category of conflict that we have seen. A third category of ethnic conflict that we have seen is basically communal clashes. So these are ethno-religious conflict, and most people would tell you that ethno-religious communal conflict mostly happened in India between Hindus and Muslims. Muslims being the largest, religious, ethno-religious minority, Hindus being the majority. But there were also significant, ethno-religious conflict between Hindus and Sikhs. I mean, I'm thinking of the 1984, the pogrom against the Sikhs after Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Hindus and Christians in parts of the, Indian Northeast, in parts of the tribal areas of India. Where Christian missionary activity is very very strong, and also we have seen sectarian violence within the Muslim community between Shias and Sunnis, or Sunnis and other sects of Islam. And finally, some would say we have also seen identity conflicts that are not so much, I would say, ethnic in the true sense of the term. But they're identity conflicts because they, there's almost a synergy of class, caste, and tribal-based identities, which have led to political agitations and armed insurgency and rebellion, especially the Maoist rebellion that former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh talked about as one of the most dangerous security challenges being faced by India. So if you want to divide ethnic conflict in India over the last 7 decades into categories, then these are the 4 main categories you are looking at. Now, having said that, if you want to try to find answers as to why this is happening in India in a in a conceptual theoretical way, then one way of looking at this is to look at how should we approach this whole question of ethnic political mobilization and ethnic political conflict. And I'm simplifying the literature out here, but generally in the literature, there are three broad approaches we can talk about in the sense of studying ethnic conflict. The first one is called the primordial approach. And the primordial approach simply believes that ethnic identity differences are natural, and therefore ethnopolitical conflicts are mainly the result of fundamental differences in identity. Now, this, of course, is a slightly older and you might say a slightly discredited explanation or approach within the field of ethnic studies or ethnic conflict studies, but nonetheless, it is there. It is one view out of at least three different alternative views. So the primordialists basically argue that, look, certain identities, ethnic identity differences are natural, they are fundamental, and therefore when we have major conflicts between ethnic groups, these are usually the result of these fundamental differences in identity. And I will give examples of this from India in a few minutes. The second approach, which is more accepted by academia, is the constructivist approach, which argues that the politicization of ethnic identity is a social construction that is done mainly to meet certain group objectives. So ethnic groups, like human beings, have objectives, have interest, they have certain needs. These needs can be addressed by mobilizing politically as an ethnic group, and therefore this political mobilization of identity is a social construction that is linked to the requirements of the group as a whole. And within that, in that context of that discussion, you could argue that the politicization of ethnic identity can be facilitated and accelerated when group elites securitize certain issues, developments as threats to group survival and group well-being. And this is obviously, coming from very mainstream social constructivist approach to security studies in the form of securitization theory, which argues that an issue becomes a threat when somebody securitizes it. And who does the securitizing? It is usually done by political elites. And why do people believe political elites? Because political elites, if they have, massive legitimacy, if they have high idiosyncrasy credit, they are likely to be believed. And it is therefore ethnic group leaders who will often create, a security concern for the group by focusing on certain issues and securitizing them. And it is this which facilitates the political mobilization of ethnic identity, leading to ethnic movements and leading to ethnic conflict and so on and so forth. So this is the constructivist approach by and large. And thirdly, another very strong approach within the field is what we call the instrumentalist approach, which basically believes that ethnic political mobilization and conflict results from the manipulation and fabrication of ethnic symbols and ethno-nationalist narrative. So basically saying that political elites, ethnic elites basically create conflict out of basically nothing, because they create, or sometimes fabricate a narrative, a war narrative, a nationalist narrative. They selectively use symbols. And why do they do that? They do that simply because having a conflict or having their group organized as a political movement is in their own personal political interest. So group elites, ethnic elites, because of their own agenda of politics, their own interest, will often politicize groups by selectively using symbols, by creating or fabricating this kind of a nationalist narrative, which would justify attacks on other groups and so on and so forth. This instrumentalist approach became very, very popular in the context of the Balkan ethnic violence that happened in the Balkans, when Yugoslavia was breaking up. I was particularly impressed at that time by the writing of scholars like V.P. Gagnon, who very powerfully argued that the war in Bosnia and the war in Croatia to some extent were manufactured wars, created wars by political elites like Milosevic, by Bosnian Serb leaders like Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, and also by Croatian leaders like Tudjman and so on. So these guys, they used ethnicity, ethnic symbols, etc. They used, or they manufactured a narrative that created a threat perception and that justified violence, that justified all kinds of atrocities against members of the other side, and that is how the conflict model was sold to the public. It was not something that happened either naturally, so rejecting the primordialist approach, or it was also not something that happened because the group felt that certain objectives or needs of the group had to be addressed through political mobilization. So V.P. Gagnon's work, I mean, if any of you are interested, there was a paper published in International Security, which I would ask you to read, which basically took the instrumentalist line and explained the sinister nature of this ethnic violence. Now, if you take a view that these three broad approaches can be applied in the case of a country like India to understand India's various types of ethnic conflicts, that would be a very interesting kind of work. And the remaining slides, I'm going to talk very briefly about that in the remaining time that I have. So very quickly, when you look at ethno-secessionist movements in India, depending on the approach that you apply, you will come up with various kinds of theoretical ideas, various kinds of explanation. So applying the primordial approach, one could argue that peripheral areas of India, so for example, the Indian Northeast or J&K, that these areas are fundamentally different from the Hindu-dominated and Hindi-speaking heartland of India. And therefore, these areas can't really be easily integrated into the rest of India, because these identity differences, in the case of Northeast, tribal identity, Christian identity, very different from mainstream heartland Indian identity. And the same is true of Jammu and Kashmir, especially the valley, which is, deeply Sunni Muslim Muslim identity. That these can't be integrated into the rest of India. And if you are following the primordialist approach, you would tend to argue that it is for this reason that these peripheral regions are so secessionist or separatist in their orientation, and this is what leads to conflict. If you look at it from a constructivist approach, though, you could argue that peripheral areas of India where secessionist sentiments are strongest, these areas face certain social, economic, and demographic challenges that threatens group survival and group well-being. And it is this that creates a threat perception for the group, and this threat perception gets strengthened as a result of central apathy or and this would often spark ethno-political agitations and conflict. So if you're looking at Assam, for example, Assam faces serious social, economic, and demographic pressure, especially with infiltration of Muslim Bengalis from Bangladesh. This creates the threat perception for the Assamese that they are going to become a minority in their own state. Assamese language will become diluted. More people are speaking Bengali. Their resources, oil, especially oil and gas, that this is, the Indian state is taking royalty out of Assam, but not putting, a lot of it back. All of this strengthens the Assamese grievance narrative, and this then feeds in with their perception that the Indian state is either neglecting them or is not very concerned about them, and this then sparks that sort of Assamese ethno-nationalist agitation and ethno-nationalist approach to this whole issue. An instrumentalist approach, thirdly, would argue that it is exigencies of politics and self-preservation which may induce ethnic political elites to manipulate ethnic symbols and fabricate victimhood narratives to spark secessionist ethno-political mobilization. So in this case, you will look at the Assamese, the politics within the Assamese group, and there's a fair bit of political outbidding going on between those who belong to mainstream parties and those who belong to more provincial or regional parties, and it is their survival instinct, it is their political interest which makes them create these kind of problems and focus on this kind of problems and create this kind of hate narrative or grievance narrative, which then feeds into this model of agitation, insurgency, etc., etc. So ethno-secession can be studied from these three different approaches. Similarly, when you look at regionalism and statehood agitations, you could look at them from these three approaches as well. So when you look at it from a primordial approach, you would have to kind of take the view that ethno-linguistic differences across India are natural, and these are recognized. These were originally recognized by the States Reorganization Commission that was set up in 1953. We have reorganized India administratively in terms of broadly ethno-linguistic states. We created, several states, 14 states in 1956. Obviously, that was not the end of it. Our numbers kept on increasing. We are now down to what? 27 or 28 states now, and there probably would be more. And this is natural. This is the way to go. Doesn't matter if we end up with 50 ethno-linguistic states, because the states then give recognition to that regional identity based on ethnicity and language. By contrast, if you take the constructivist approach, the basic argument here is that the sons of the soil, that each region has local people and outsiders. So you look at it from that point of view, that there are some people who are local, some people who are outsiders. And it is the locals, the sons of the soil, who must become beneficiaries of preferential and affirmative action policies and regional development. So when regional development happens, when affirmative action policies happen, the bulk of the benefit must go to the sons of the soil, who are the local people and not the outsiders. I've heard this argument in Darjeeling in a very prominent way. When I was writing my paper and I was doing field work in Darjeeling, I was talking to Gorkha leaders. All of them talked about this, that we want the development money to be spent here to be in our control. This money is the benefit of this money, the benefit of this aid must go to the Gorkhas. And there was also the victim narrative, which is that, and true partly, that Bengalis, who control power in West Bengal, sitting in Calcutta, they actually haven't done a lot for the Gorkhas or the Nepalis of the Darjeeling or the hill. And there's substance to some of that claim. So the argument here is that when you look at it from a constructivist point of view, that people are asking for not only power, but the power to then use development, use preferential policies in a way that benefits the local over the outsider. And of course, hand in hand with that argument is the other argument, which is that the best way to achieve this outcome is to have regional parties based on regional identity in local and state government. So Shiv Sena in Maharashtra basically made that argument that we need a Maharashtrian party for the Marathi Manus, who will be now in local government, in state government, and who would then direct the lion's share of development and preferential policies for the Marathi. And this presupposes, in a way, there is an assumption here, which is that local leaders, local agents are better able to solve local problems. And again, I heard this in Darjeeling saying, people sitting in Calcutta don't understand our problems. If we had power and if we had control over the money, and the Gorkha National Liberation Front was there at that time, we can then kickstart Darjeeling and the hills development better than that this is done by outsiders. And Shiv Sena or any other regional party would make the same kind of argument. Also keep in mind that in making that argument, some parties, and again I'm thinking of Shiv Sena, will victimize the outsider, saying it is because of the outsider the local people are in an inferior position, that the outsiders have come and taken over everything. And you can imagine, in the 1960s, 70s, some of the violence that the Shiv Sena unleashed on non-Marathis in Maharashtra, particularly people who came to work in Mumbai from Bihar, from South India, and so on. Now, if you look at it from an instrumentalist approach point of view, you could argue that local elites like Subhas Ghising or Bimal Gurung in Gorkhaland, these guys are after power, which may then lead to self-preservation and self-advancement. Subhas Ghising probably was the most corrupt, Gorkha politician ever in Gorkhaland history. A guy who never submitted accounts of the Gorkha Hill Council that was created. So these guys, from an instrumentalist point of view, they are after power, but to do what? To self-preservation, self-advancement. And therefore, they manipulate ethnic symbols and fabricate victimhood narratives to spark political mobilization and conflict. And for them, it is very convenient to blame the outsider for all the local problems. So in Darjeeling, I heard, you Bengalis, you guys have always done harm to us. You guys have never done the right thing. Why is there no engineering college in Darjeeling? Why is there no medical college in Darjeeling? Why is it that Gorkha people, if they have to study medicine or engineering, have to go down to the plains, at least to Siliguri, to study in North Bengal University, and so on and so forth. Similarly, when you look at communal conflict, another form of ethnic conflict, you can again divide it into those three approaches. And I don't want to go into details because I think I'm going to run out of time, but you can have a look at the slide later on. But it's fundamentally the same argument. The primordialists, people like Paul Brass, they have argued that Hindus and Muslims are too different, and therefore peaceful coexistence between them is almost practically difficult or impossible. Some scholars, Paul Brass himself, he has referred to thoughts of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, saying that even Ambedkar had doubts if Hindus and Muslims could live peacefully in India, especially in the context of the partition of 1947. I don't want to go into that, but the essence of this is the argument, and which was obviously the core argument of the Muslim League and Jinnah, that Hindus and Muslims are very different, and their way of life, their outlook, their ideology, everything is so different that for them to live or coexist peacefully would be very difficult. And from a primordialist standpoint, people who write on communal violence often offer this argument. People like those have written on this. They essentially make 3 points. One, socioeconomic standards of Indian Muslims are far below compared to the other groups. This generates a kind of rage within the Muslim community that comes out in the form of communal violence. They refer to the Sachar Committee report and so on. Ashutosh Varshney, in his book on ethnic violence and civic nationalism, talked about the absence of social linkages between Hindus and Muslims, and riots didn't take place and where conflict was present. Williams, in a paper to Journal of South Asian Development several years ago, argued about the role of human agency, especially top Hindu leaders and Muslim leaders who get together to diffuse crises before the crisis then becomes a major political problem. And then if you look at the instrumentalist, I would refer to the work of Paul Wilkinson. Paul Wilkinson's basic approach is, look, communal conflicts in India are caused by political parties and political leaders, especially if they are convinced that by having a communal conflict, you will have polarization of Hindu and Muslim votes, and this polarization of Hindu and Muslim votes will help them win elections. So Communal conflict, according to Paul Wilkinson, is basically a function of electoral politics. If political parties calculate they can win elections better by having total polarization of Hindu-Muslim votes, you're probably going to see a communal violence or communal conflict, which creates that sort of polarization, especially in areas where there is mixed population. And finally, if you look at the caste, class, tribal insurgencies, use the Maoists as an example. Again, you can look at it from these three perspectives. Primordialist approach would see a natural identity difference between a rural poor India and an urban rich India. This natural division between rural poor and urban rich, they would argue, also overlaps with India's caste and tribal identity. And within rural India itself, you could also see higher caste groups are richer, more prosperous, and more powerful compared to lower caste and tribal groups. And anybody who's been into the the tribal belt of West Bengal or Jharkhand or Bihar would understand what I'm talking about. If you look at it from a constructivist point of view, you could argue that social constructivists situate class, caste, tribal agitations and insurgencies in India within the broader peasant movement in India. And this is very, sort of Marxist analysis driven literature out there on peasant movements and peasant agitations and peasant revolt in India. And this literature talks about the structural conditions of exploitation that affect the poor, landless, marginalized farmers. And eventually, this reality sparks violent peasant movements dominated by Marxist thinkers who see the state and empowered social groups in rural areas as essentially exploitative. So exploitation of the landless, of the poor farmers, of the marginalized farmers, the role of the moneylender, how exploitative the moneylender is, the basic division between lower caste, lower class, and tribal groups on one side, and the upper caste, upper class, rich people on the other side. This distinction is very Marxist in orientation, and a lot of this social constructivist approach to this kind of theorizing comes from that literature. And the instrumentalist group, which is a more recent argument that some scholars are making, which basically says, look, political parties and leaders, especially in Maoist infested states, they use the rural poor and the rural caste groups and the tribal groups as vote banks. So basically what they do is they stoke insurgency as long as they can control it, but they hardly ever solve the problems that lead to the insurgencies. In other words, what you are getting in states like West Bengal with Jungle Mahal and so on is basically a very vicious politics of poverty, that people want to exploit poverty, people want to exploit tribal identity, people want to exploit caste politics, but the governments in power, whether it was the 34 years of Marxist rule and now 10 years of Trinamool Congress, nobody has done anything to actually solve these problems, because solving these problems does not help their politics. So for these parties to be politically relevant and use these groups to win votes and win elections means that the problem continues. It is just that they can control the insurgency within certain parameters, and they do that by various methods of control, by various methods of co-optation, and so on and so forth. As a case in point, I can tell you that I go a lot to the district of Purulia, and I used to go there in the 1970s as a young person, and I used to see absolute abject condition of the rural tribal population, population or groups like the Bauris and so on. And in 2018, when I last went, I was supposed to go again last year, but couldn't obviously go because of the COVID restrictions. But in 2018, when I last went, believe me, the condition of the Bauris in many of the villages were exactly the same as I had seen them and I had remembered them from the 1970s and 1980s, which kind of gives you the impression that nobody did a damn thing about these people. It's just that, they have been used as political fodder, and many of their leaders, Bauri leaders, have been co-opted into the political movement, into the political parties. These leaders have suddenly discovered a very easy way of making money, and they have, they drive around in big 4x4 cars, and they have beautiful apartments and houses, and the people they represent are still mired in abject poverty, which gives you the impression that everybody is using these sort of things, identities, for their own political agendas, but not doing anything to solve the problem. So final thoughts. I thought, I want to end on this by saying that my view is that ethnic conflict will continue in many shapes and forms in India going forward. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister, had once called the Maoist rebellion the biggest security threat. And it is, again, not a surprise that Home Minister Amit Shah, I think yesterday, had a big meeting with the chief ministers of all the states where the Maoist problems are. And he's trying to come up with a comprehensive action plan to deal with this problem. So Manmohan Singh had talked about this almost 10 years ago, and 10 years later, Amit Shah is still dealing with that problem. Secondly, my gut feeling is that separatist violence, secessionist violence, especially in Jammu and Kashmir Valley, is likely to intensify in the next few years, now that the Taliban has won in Afghanistan and Pakistan's attention once again is back on J&K. So the infiltration grid, the insurgency grid in J&K, I think, is going to get stronger as we move forward. So there might be turbulent times ahead in terms of dealing with that. Thirdly, regionalism, statehood agitations, I think, are by no means over. I'm particularly interested to look at the Gorkhaland issue again, especially it has now been expanded into a sort of a North Bengal versus South Bengal issue. BJP MP, John Barla, has actually now come out in Bengal and talked about, the need for the center to create a separate state out of North Bengal. And he's been giving, all kinds of security reasons why it should be done. So that might be something that will play around for a while in Bengal. And I don't mean to suggest that the story is over there for all intents and purposes. Similarly, Amit Shah and Modi have been very proactive in trying to deal with insurgencies in the Northeast. They think that development is the answer. They think that infrastructure is the answer. And of course, the Indian government, within the federal polity that we have, is trying to accommodate smaller identities through various kinds of, development accords and, development councils and so on and so forth. And last but not least is the big question about communal riots. We haven't seen one big one under Modi so far, and that's a huge plus. But we did see in a smaller scale, the Delhi riots, the communal riots that happened last year. We saw the Shaheen Bagh protests. So my gut feeling is that going forward, if we are going to have, implementation of NRC, implementation of Universal Civil Code, and of course, the more mainstreaming of the Citizenship Amendment Act and so on and so forth, things could get heated up very quickly in India going forward. So overall, I think the picture is that there's a lot to be concerned about, and ethnic problems, ethnic politics in India will continue to bubble. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I have taken a bit more time, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that fascinating lecture. We indeed learned quite a lot. It was an excellent overview of the ethno-nationalist and secessionist problems that we have in India, and also an analysis of what has been happening, and probably the way forward as well. And now, without wasting much time, I think I'll open the floor for the students if they want to ask any questions. I think Shanba Gargi Lakshmi Narayan, I think you want to ask a question. Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
I'm Gargi, a second year student at the department. That was an interesting lecture. I have three questions for you. They are all interconnected. To
Okay.
begin with, I wanted to know the difference between ethnicity and civilization because India is a civilizational state, but I didn't come across that term in your presentation at all. Secondly, do you think there has been a certain serious amount of negligence in studying India's civilizational makeup? And finally, in consequence, when civilizational narrative is pushed forward by Hindus, why it is termed as a conflict, political manipulation, and communal, etc., since it will severely hamper civilizational nation building when it comes to with respect to India.
Okay.
Thank you,
Fair
sir.
questions. Good questions. Do you want me to answer them or want to take a few more?
So I think you can answer that since she's asked three
Okay.
questions in a row. I think you can better address that.
Okay. I think you are looking at this issue from the point of view of somebody like Samuel Huntington, when he talked about civilizational identities. And Samuel Huntington wrote a paper initially and then wrote a major book, The Clash of Civilizations. Um, and our Chief of Defense Staff, General Bipin Rawat, recently has been talking about civilizational clashes between India and China and India and Pakistan. The basic approach of a civilization model is that the world is divided into broadly 8 civilizations, as Huntington said, and he did include India as a civilization, and he used the term Hindu civilization. Um, what he meant was that civilization identity is the broadest possible identity that a person can have. So you can be a Bengali, you can be, from southern Bengal, you can be from eastern India, you can be an Indian, but according to Huntington, at the very broadest level, you are part of this Indian civilization, which he called Hindu civilization. And therein comes your second and third question. Why is that term problematic? The term is problematic simply because a lot of people equate Hinduism with a particular religious practice. That 80% of India's population practice a religion called Hinduism. So if you look at it purely from the point of view of a religion, then one could argue that if you focus on that, then you're excluding people in India who happen to be Indian citizens but who are not practicing Hindus. On the other hand, there's a different way of looking at Hindu identity, which is to look at it as a civilizational identity, in the sense that it is not just a religion, it is basically a cultural identity that probably is old as at least 3,000 years, if not older. So anything between 3,000, 5,000 years old, a form of cultural identity, a way of life of people, not an organized religion, remember, uh, that also can be looked at as a Hindu civilization. And if you look at it from that point of view, then you could argue that anybody who's in South Asia, especially the Indian subcontinent, probably is a Hindu from a civilizational point of view. That if we all trace our ancestry back 3,000, 4,000 years, uh, irrespective of what we are today, we are all Hindus. We are part of that civilizational identity. Um, how good that is from the point of view of doing politics is a problematic question. Can you convince everybody that's the way we should look at it? Um, I mean, look at the amount of trouble that somebody like Mohan Bhagwat got into when he said that Indian Muslims are also technically Hindus because they come from that tradition, that civilizational identity of being Hindus. Um, And therein lies, your problem of, how do you play with that idea? How do you define that idea? Why it has been neglected, I think, look, I would argue it has not been neglected. I think it has always been there. If you look at the alternative literature on identity politics in India, if you look at writings of Savarkar, if you look at writing, the ideology of the RSS, if you look at, even I would say, go back and look at some of the writings of Subhash Chandra Bose, or some of Bose's ideas, and how Bose conceived of Indian identity. Very strongly in that is this notion of India being a Hindu civilization. And why just India? I mean, Nepal used to be a Hindu civilization as well until the Maoists changed that. Nepal no longer is a Hindu country after the Maoists were able to get rid of the king and rewrite the constitution. And again, I mean, depending on at which point you want to start your narrative, if you go back, look, I mean, my view is that Islam was founded only in the 7th century and came to India around the 1000 AD mark. If you say, for example, that our civilization is at least 3000 years old, then Hinduism and then offshoots of Hinduism in the form of Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, these are probably more defining of our cultural practices than simply looking at it as organized religion in the form of Hindus and Muslims.
Thank you for that answer, sir. I think Gargi, he's answered your question. Now, moving on to the next question, I think it's from Debraj Krishnataraya. Go on, Debraj.
Sir, actually, you talked about Amit Shah and Modi intervening in Northeast to address the current issues. So an intervention actually took place, and I am from Assam, northeastern part of the country, and I actually know what happened because Amit Shah was in Assam itself while he addressed this issue. So on July 25th, 2021, that is Sunday, he said, speaking in Assam, he said the formation of BJP government in the state for the second time means it has permanently rejected terrorism and riots to move towards development. But sir, like Shillong, Meghalaya is just, 2-3 hours drive away from Guwahati, and 10 militant groups are still currently active in Shillong, and they also attacked the chief minister's house, like Conrad Sangma, the CM of Shillong, Meghalaya's house. So yes, intervention.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm familiar with the scenario. So ask what question you're asking.
So, sir, the thing is that do you think that the progress that is actually expected, it might actually take longer than what they have promised?
Look, this is not an easy task. You're not going to be able to solve this problem overnight. This is going to take enormous amount of time, patience, diplomacy, all kinds of stuff. There is also this side of insurgency that you guys probably know about, which is that insurgency often creates a very perverse form of insurgency economy, as we say. The World Bank actually did a lot of work on this, not in India but in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So the works of Paul Collier, Nick Sambanis, etc. And what they found was that oftentimes the basic logic of the insurgency is that the insurgents want to control a certain area because this area has got a lot of lootable resources, gold, diamond, whatever you find. So it is this that is incentivizing the insurgency, not major ethnic grievances per se. Yes, everybody is poor, but the insurgency then allows you to hollow out the state and it allows you to control these resources, which then goes to your benefit. My sense is that in the India Northeast, a similar kind of logic is often at play, that the state believes that, because of endemic poverty, unemployment, etc., these local boys are gravitating towards insurgency and picking up the gun. So as soon as they create trouble, they pump in more money into the region, and in a perverse sense that drives the insurgency. So these local guys, they realize that the more trouble we create, the more money is going to come in. I will tell you an incident. I won't name anybody's name. This happened in a northeastern state when, before a state election, the chief minister basically reached out to these insurgents, said, look guys, I don't like any trouble because we have an election coming up. People need to feel secure so that they will vote for the government again. So in the middle of the night, 5 big suitcases full of cash was given to the insurgents, and the insurgents came to the chief minister's bungalow to pick up those suitcases. So, in a perverse sense, I mean, that is what sometimes drives the local insurgents. They are not doing it because they have a huge cause, or they are really defending identity or whatever it is. It's more mundane things that we'll get more money, or somebody will say, okay, what would it take for you to stop killing people? Do you want a job? Okay, I'll give you a job. So my aim is to get a job. And sometimes your aim might be to loot a bank. If you loot a bank, if you or I go and loot a bank, we are criminals. But these guys, just because they are insurgents, if they go loot a bank, it suddenly has more legitimacy tag to it, saying we are insurgents, we have to fund our movement, so therefore we looted a bank. So all these kind of things come in, but that doesn't mean that you neglect the Northeast. I think Modi and Amit Shah is right that infrastructure has to be built. A sense of confidence has to be generated. Keep in mind also that the Northeast collectively contribute less than 5% of India's population. So when you are going to spend a disproportionate amount of money in the Northeast, you will have to justify it not just in terms of solving insurgency or local problems, but in the wider scale of things, which is to create connectivity between India and Southeast Asia through the Indian Northeast. And some of this is already happening, is my argument.
Yes, sir, it has. Actually, I see a lot of infrastructure development taking place, and I also see some mobilization of human resources, like a lot of like dignitary army officials and police officials have moved. Also, experts in different fields, right from management to medical sciences, have come in, and they are contributing towards the development on a political, economical, social, technological, and legal scales.
Correct. And again, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they are building universities out in the Northeast. They're building AIMS, I think. AIMS hospitals is being built in the Northeast.
Yes, sir.
They are building these, fantastic roads connecting the various states of the Northeast, and also with Myanmar, and through Myanmar to Thailand and rest of Southeast Asia. So give it another 20 years, and then you will see the difference.
Yes, sir. I can expect a change in the next 20 years, but as they promised that things are going to change in 5 years, and like strongly he said that terrorism has permanently stopped, I don't think that can be done overnight.
No, don't take those words too literally. These are politicians. They say things for political consumption. But on the other hand, look at it also from the point of view of a real change. I think before Modi came to power in 2014, my sense was, I've been to the Northeast several times and I've got good friends from there. My sense was that there was this general perception that the Indian central government was neglecting the Northeast. They were not really seriously interested. And a lot of my Northeast friends tells me that part of the reason they understood is because, they have so little population compared to the rest of India. So they were literally a periphery of India, not in a territorial sense, but in a population sense. That I think perception has changed now. I think people are beginning to believe Modi when he says, I actually take the Northeast very seriously. And the Northeast is important for my government. Several ministers in Modi's cabinet in government from the Northeast. So I think in 7 years you have seen quite a bit of positive change, is my argument,
Yes, sir.
and
That I
may that
definitely have.
continue.
Yes, and that
All
also
right,
is
Dilraj, we
expect.
can leave it at that and give an opportunity to others if they have any question.
Yeah, sure, sir. And thank you, Rajat sir, for addressing all my queries.
Thank you. Good queries.
Okay, so if there are no questions, I do. I mean, let me ask you a question. I
Okay.
understand that the whole concept of ethnic conflict and conflict resolution is quite complex. You just laid it out for the last two questioners. So, having seen your assessment of the nature of the conflict itself, one from a constructivist point of view, from an instrumentalist point of view, and a primordial approach as well. What role do you think has force got to do? What is the role of what are the strengths and opportunities for the utility of force in conflict resolution in case of ethnic conflicts? Because I ask this because I've also observed that you've worked on Sri Lanka and you've seen that the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka was by and large resolved thanks to the use of force in
Yeah, but
2009.
those are rare exceptions.
Exactly. So what do
Dhiraj,
you think? Yeah.
I would caution you to. I mean, look. I mean, my view is that what you could do in Sri Lanka, America couldn't do to the Taliban in Afghanistan,
Okay.
because the lay of the land is very different. Sri Lanka is a small country; it's an island, and eventually the tigers were trapped in a very small, narrow piece of land, and their escape route, which is through the sea, was effectively blocked by the Indian Navy. So, India obviously played a role in this. I mean, nobody's going to talk about it, but that's a fact. Sri Lanka would not have dared to do what they did without tacit approval from India. And everybody was on the same page, saying, we want good things for the Tamils in Sri Lanka, but we don't think LTT is the answer. And part of the problem also was that everybody understood that if the LTT was successful, it would create a very illiberal outcome. It would be a Tamil Elam totally controlled by them. They would be as bad as the Taliban, in their area.
Right.
So I think you shouldn't compare that model with everywhere else. Everywhere else, it's a different ballgame. My sense is, having talked to a lot of senior bureaucrats in Delhi, there are two ways of looking at it. One is what is we call the bus analogy, and a lot of people told me this analogy in the context of the Northeast, and the previous question was also in a sense connected to that, which is you can't really solve insurgency in the Northeast because it is like a moving bus. People get in, after a little while they get off, and new passengers get in, and the bus keeps moving. So insurgency is like a bus. Today there are 5 groups who are agitating. You make a deal with them. Tomorrow another 5 groups come. So insurgency will continue. It will never stop. So your question, which is how do we then manage it? One way of doing it is through control mechanisms. And control mechanism for the state is basically this. If 5 people are dying every month, I can live with that. But if 50 people are dying every month, I can't. I have to push these groups underground. I have to put the heat on them. And putting the heat on them means arresting some of them, stopping their funding, pushing them into the jungles, intercepting their weapons supplies, whatever. And in some cases, shoot out with them with the intention of not taking prisoners, but just kill them, so that they will lie low for a while and not create too much trouble. So there are various ways of doing that. Sometimes we do that through giving them cash incentives, saying don't create trouble, take the money, just be quiet for a while. And that's how you manage. But management is very different from resolving, because some of the deeper problems, I think, my feeling is that Modi is right in basically saying, look, there are deeper structural problems here, which has not been addressed in almost 70 years. And somebody has to start. And this is going to be a slow process, laborious process. This process will sometimes get derailed because the local politics can get very vicious. I mean, you recently saw between Assam and Mizoram what happened, right? So control mechanism is a stopgap measure. You can put the heat on them and keep it low for a while, below a threshold that you can live with. But then hopefully you start doing the other things that eventually addresses the deeper structural problems that are there. And in the Northeast, I think, infiltration of Bangladesh is a big problem because, land density is so high and population is so big. You hardly would have any land anymore, for cultivation and so on. Then there's the question of cultural dilution. The more Bengali speakers in Assam, the Assamese get very agitated, saying that, over time we are going to lose our Assamese identity. And one of the big reasons why India created ethno-linguistic states is to protect these ethno-linguistic, forms of identity, which includes language. So all of that needs to be addressed, but how quickly you do that, how you're able to do it, whether that means border fencing, whether that means NRC and sending people back, it's a complicated problem. It's a difficult problem, but somebody has to start somewhere. And that's why I said, maybe we should wait until 2050 with the momentum that we have now, and then come back and see if we are still alive, in 2050, where we are.
So one of the criticisms that I hear from informed analysts is that dialogue is all fine, but if you have bureaucrats as interlocutors, there is always bound to be a problem because they are confining to their bureaucratic interests. Instead, there have to be politicians as interlocutors. Would you agree with that? Rather than having the IB director, an ex-IB director, or another bureaucrat, have a politician who can have a dialogue with these northeastern insurgents. Sorry, yeah.
Again, it can cut different ways. I mean, sometimes, bureaucrats can be actually a positive force because they know the law, they know what is possible and what is not possible. Whereas politicians will come in and look at it from the point of view of what is going to help them politically. So, when you make a deal, when you make an understanding with somebody, yes, it's in a sense a political agreement, but the political agreement also has to be implementable on the ground, because if you have a gap between what you agreed and what you could deliver, then you have a problem, right? And the insurgency will be quiet for a while, but then will come back. And it is not just India specific. We have seen this evidence in other parts as well. I mean, the most common example today is actually Colombia, that the FARC guerrillas are coming back, because whatever peace deal was signed, half of it has not been implemented. So this gap between what you promise and what you can implement, this gap happens because of, politicians pull in one direction, bureaucrats can deliver something else. So you have to be a bit cautious as to what you are promising and what you are delivering, is my sense. But then again, look, I mean, at the end of the day, I read in the Indian paper today that Amit Shah has apparently given the green signal to Chief Minister, Sarma to go and start talking with Ulfa and some of the other Assamese groups. How convincing he's going to be, I don't know. What he's going to promise, I don't know. So we'll have to wait and watch and see what advice he gets from bureaucrats. And when I say bureaucrats, I mean both the police, the civilian bureaucracy, and maybe even people on the ground, people local level, councillors and so on, who have a better handle of things. By contrast, this is exactly the approach India followed in Jammu and Kashmir. This decision to abrogate Article 370, 35A, and then sending central teams to work with a newly created group of grassroots leaders who are not from the mainstream political parties, with a very different approach that India has adopted in J&K. And touch wood, it will work if they can keep the infiltration under control. So it's a difficult thing to say. It's not a one way or the other option. I think you have to be very judicious in terms of who you involve and what you promise and what you can deliver.
Thank you very much for that, sir. I think Shravan had a question. Shravan, are you still here?
Yes, sir.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, sir. Hello, sir. Thank you,
Hi.
lecture. Sir, so as you said, there are even in the states there are separatist movements or statehood movements like Kantapur and Gorkhaland,
Correct.
and even in the other states they are like very diverse, and there is regionalism. Even in Karnataka, I'm from Karnataka, and here
Okay.
it's very diverse. North Karnataka is there is lot of underdevelopment in North Karnataka also, and time to time they also raise such demands. But so, do you think that there needs to be further decentralization with this regard, and further creation of maybe autonomous provinces within these states? Is that a good idea to counter these kind of demands?
Well, that's certainly is an option. I mean, my view is that uh, I don't see a problem in having smaller states. My gut feeling is that smaller states are actually more democratic. There's local accountability that's going to happen. Um, and in a sense, I mean, I think it empowers people. When power is close to you, it empowers you. I mean, take as an example, this demand for Gorkhaland. Some of the sentiments of the Darjeeling Gorkhas. Their argument is that in the West Bengal Assembly of 284 members, there are only a few members from Darjeeling, and overall, less than 20 MLAs from the northern hill districts. That's not very empowering, is it? Because you're not going to be very close to decisions that the government is going to make. So their argument is that if we have smaller states, it is more manageable. It would bring power closer to people, and in that sense, people will have greater scrutiny and accountability of decision makers. So it's more democratic. Um, and in today's world, if you are a small state, you can still be economically viable provided you play your cards right. So my anticipation is, my feeling is that if India goes to, let's say to the extent of the United States and creates 50 states, some of them small, you break up the big ones, you break up Karnataka, you break up maybe Maharashtra. There's a movement for Vidarbha in Maharashtra, the Nagpur region. What is wrong with that? If you break up other relatively bigger states into smaller units, and if these smaller units are economically viable, they are efficiently run, um, they empower people, they are under close scrutiny of the population. I personally don't see anything wrong in it or anything bad in it. The counter argument to this, of course, is that this increases administrative cost. Instead of paying salaries of 27, 28 chief ministers, you might have to pay salaries of 50 chief ministers and 50 sets of state bureaucrats and so on and so forth. But each state can decide, how it's going to handle its budget. Um, and and obviously in India, if you have 50 states, some will be well run, some will be good states, and some will be terrible states. But then the terrible states would have themselves to blame, I think, for being terrible. You just can't say that, look, everything is somebody else's fault. So my suggestion is, put people to the test. Create smaller states and let's see what happens.
Right. Thank you for that, sir. And are there any more questions that you people would like to ask? Okay, so if there aren't any, then I'd like to now just give me a second, sir. I'd like to have. Can we now move to the vote of thanks? Anand, are you here?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, so I now request our postgraduate student, Ms. Induja JS, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. It is such an honor for me to get the opportunity to propose the vote of thanks today. On behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, I extend my gratitude to all present in the webinar. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to Professor Dr. Rajat Ganguly for accepting our invitation and for the very meaningful and structured lecture on this very pertinent topic. From giving an understanding on India's ethnic diversity, sir, you explain how India's ethnic pluralism is managed through fundamental rights, administrative reorganization, federal polity, secularism, multi-party system, etc. So you also gave a clear understanding on the various typologies of ethnic conflicts and as to how to approach the study of ethnic political mobilization and conflict through a primordial, constructivist, and instrumentalist approach. The categories of conflict were explained through these approaches with contemporary examples also. By giving your final thoughts, the lecture indeed opened up new areas to analyze the way forward for us. Thank you so much, sir, for the thought-provoking and interesting lecture. I would also like to thank our Associate Professor and Head of the Department, Dr. Nanda Kishore, for organizing the lecture and giving us this opportunity. I would also like to thank Dr. Anand, sir, for building the context and giving the welcome remarks to this distinguished lecture. I would also like to express my thanks to Dr. Dheeraj, Assistant Professor, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, for moderating and coordinating this event. I would like to thank all the participants who have turned up for our department and also from outside the department for their participation and valuable cooperation. Once again, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Professor Ganguly.
Thank you, sir.
Unfortunately, I was in another meeting to join you. I look forward to interacting with you again.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation to deliver this lecture.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.